What's up, Cecil? How you doing?
Hey, Chris, I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm good, man. I'm good. Hey, so thank you for jumping on the show today. I wanted to bring you on because I see somebody who, and you're going to tell your backstory. And I actually don't even know all of it. I just know a few of the things. And it's so intriguing of somebody who can go from one industry to another. And it seems to me like it's a completely different industry, you can say. But just so the listeners know, we met each other through a mutual friend. I we both got a buddy by the name of Brett, a really good guy who flips properties here in Arizona. And I was introduced to him a few years ago. I had a past client who had told him to call me to sell his properties. So when he started flipping properties, he called me. I sold his first one. Then I started helping him find properties, and then I'd help him sell them. He got his real estate license, and but we've always remained friends and always will be friends. And so, anyways, a few months ago, he introduced us. We got on a Zoom, I remember, and he was like, "Hey, you guys got to meet each other." What was cool about that, man, is how we just jumped on a Zoom and had no like intentions or what even we didn't even know what we were going to talk about on that Zoom. Brett just like, "Hey, you guys got to talk." So I remember scheduling a Zoom with you, and I've always been down like to just get on Zooms with people and just have a conversation for 30 minutes because I've always found out that I'm better for it. If I can just learn more people's stories in the space, no matter if it ever makes me any money or whatever, it's just like I knew I was going to learn something from you that day. So we jumped on a Zoom. We kind of had a just a casual talk, and then here we are. So I want you to tell this story, but you kind of had a different career and decided to get into flipping, and it looks like you're going in pretty hard. I've actually looked up some of your numbers yesterday on the MLS, and I was like, yeah, like I mean, you definitely went in from your space to a new space, and you're doing well. So if you could tell me a little bit of your backstory of like why you got your real estate license and why you went into the I'm gonna flip property space.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you brought the backstory in with Brett because I don't know if you know this, but Brett and I grew up together. So we actually used to play basketball together as kids, and we were like really close friends.
I had
And the
no
reason,
idea.
yeah,
I
yeah.
thought
So
you
we
guys
played.
might have met at like a mastermind where you flippers all get together and talk shop and strategy. Okay, that makes
You would
sense
think,
then.
right? Yeah, yeah, you
Okay.
would think, and that's usually how I meet a lot of people in this space. But yeah, Brett and I grew up together, and the reason he actually told me to reach out to you is because we were having a couple conversations about how I'm trying to systematize and automate a lot of the components in the flipping business. And he's like, "Dude, you've got to talk to Chris Bowers. Like this guy's he's mastered the art. You've got to get on a call with him." So that's kind of how that sort of came together. But
Super
yeah,
cool.
so my career originally at a very early age, I think I realized I kind of wanted to do a lot of things in this world, and I couldn't really pinpoint exactly what that was. I was interested in physics, I was interested in chemistry, biology, but it was all really in the field of STEM. So I ended up getting my bachelor's degree in molecular and cellular biology. I was pre-med for a long time, ended up going down the PhD route, became fascinated with cancer biology, and then I continued into my fellowship studying that in more granular detail. And I really loved that role and that lifestyle that I had, where I was trying to, better the world one step at a time in the world of cancer biology. And as an academic scientist, it was really cool. You spent a lot of time in the lab. It was a really fun lifestyle. But I got tired of it when I was in my fellowship. I had dealt with some odd politics that are in that space, and then there's a lot of like you require grants in order for you to remain funded. And anyway, the lifestyle was a little different than what I expected. So I jumped ship from an academic scientist into a commercial scientist, and I went into the diagnostic space. And I did that professionally for a few years. I enjoyed it. I enjoyed what I was doing. It was a completely different world, but something was lacking. I just felt like I was putting all this time and effort in one direction. I didn't feel like a scientist anymore. I almost felt like I was just part of this corporate ladder, where I wasn't really chasing the learning curve. And I think that's kind of to your point earlier, where I dive head in or head first into something. I really enjoy learning. I think over the years of being in school for so long, that learning curve is something that I'm a little addicted to. And once I've gotten to a point where I've stabilized the learning, I think I do lose interest, and that's probably to a fault of mine. But I was doing that in this diagnostic space for a while, and then also dealing with corporate management and some negativity and toxicity in the space. And all while that was happening, I started to pick up more entrepreneurial books. I started listening to the Bigger Pockets podcast, doing the things that I think a lot of people do early on in the investor career. And then I made, for better or worse, the decision to read two books in 1 month. I read Rich Dad Poor Dad by Robert Kiyosaki, and then I read The 4 Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And those two books just like they ruined my life and also made my life like made led to a lot of really different decisions. You're laughing, so I know you've probably read both of those books.
I've read them when I was up, I think a teenager, at least the Kiyosaki books. Yeah. So I mean they were game changers. In the 4 Hour Work Week, I mean, even though it feels like it's kind of a myth, it's more to me, it's like an idea of how you can leverage out your life. Um, I'm fascinated by that book. And ever since I've read it probably 8 years ago, I've seen different stages of my life where I definitely don't have a 4 hour work week but I do have several businesses, and I do have some that are not even 4 hours a month, so it's like you can get it in some avenues of your life. So, but that's cool that that book sparked you.
Yeah, yeah, and I believe it
So
because that's what.
did that just, I mean, were you scientists and you went into a Barnes and Noble and just picked these books up? Like, how did that happen? Where, I mean, did you used to have any dreams of real estate or doing that? Like, how did you get that book in your hand?
Yeah, honestly, I have no idea. So the books that I typically read when I was in that stage of my life were all medicine and science related, and I've been a pretty avid reader in adulthood. Um, and I think when I was in graduate school, I started focusing on financial literacy. I was really going down the Dave Ramsey approach of just like, beating down my debt. And I didn't know too much about investing in real estate, but I knew about investing in 401ks and Roth IRAs. And so I was going down that path. And I think that trajectory probably led me to Rich Dad Poor Dad. And then I don't know how I ended up with the 4 Hour Work Week. Somebody may have recommended it. Um, but you can imagine, like, as you said, like a scientist and in science, you don't really get trained on how to manage your finances, how to become financially literate. So when I read those two books, this whole new world of like passive income and entrepreneurialism just like started flowing, and I'd never experienced this before in my life. And that's probably a criticism that I have in the field of science, especially in like graduate school, is they don't really teach you how to start a business, which is a huge avenue in the world of science. They really just teach you how to be either an academic scientist or an industry scientist. They don't really teach you how to be an entrepreneur. So this whole world had opened up to me. And it was terrifying, but I was like, okay, this seems possible, right? I could eventually step away from this world of industry science and then move into more of an investor type role. And that's kind of the thinking that I had at the time. And I wasn't super happy in the role that I had either. In the world of science, I think I probably mentioned that there was just some toxicity in the space. So I was kind of looking for an out in some capacity. And so real estate made sense to me. And it's not that I have this like massive passion for real estate that I think a lot of people do. I think I have more of a passion for entrepreneurialism and what types of avenues are available to you when you do that. And real estate just made sense to me because I had purchased my own home, and I'm like, oh, okay, I can tangibly understand how you can get into real estate investing and leverage this to make more, capital over time. So after those, sorry, that was a long segue,
No,
but
dude, you're good.
after reading those books, I decided to purchase my first rental. So I was like, okay, I have the knowledge. I listened to a lot of podcasts, and I dove deeper into the space and started reading more books. And so I think within a few months, I decided, okay, it was time to get my feet wet, and I bought my first rental. That went over fairly well. I was self-managing for a while, and I did that for about 3 months, and I realized, hey, I want to start buying more rentals. But on the trajectory that I was on as a scientist, I was making okay money, but not enough money to purchase more rentals at the velocity that I was hoping. And so I got this great idea to flip a house. I was like, hey, what's one way I can make a massive influx of capital quickly? And I had heard that flipping houses was one way to do that. So I gave it a shot. And I don't know if you want to dive into that first flip or maybe those
No, I
thereafter, but that's
I definitely do. And even going back to, so what took you down the path of bigger pockets? Do you remember how you connected to that podcast?
um, you know what? I think it was a Google search. I was looking at different investment strategies, and Bigger Pockets came up. It was much smaller then. I mean, it was still a big, it was a giant compared to some other podcasts, but I think it was mostly a Google search that led me in that direction.
Yeah, because I'm still trying to figure out. That's actually what got me intrigued in having investment properties or rentals. And so, I mean, this was going back probably 9 years ago, but I mean, I remember even before I've been selling real estate for probably 8 years and still didn't own a property. And I just remember somehow I got into the bigger pocket space and started listening to those podcasts. And I think when you hear those people's stories, you listen to a show and it's some guy in Ohio who has 142
Yeah.
rentals, and you're just like, what? Like it was cool because it just always a different story from somebody, and they all did it a different way. Some, had money, some didn't, some owned hundreds of properties, some don't nine. And it just gave you this belief that you could do it, because you'd hear these people's stories. And that's why I like doing this podcast. That's why I want to bring you on this show, because I want more and more people to hear those stories of people that just like literally course corrected by hearing someone's stories and placing a bet and saying they can believe in themselves. But I really wish I could figure out how I got onto that show, because it was such a big part of my life for probably 4 years. And I don't listen to it as much anymore. But I mean, that was actually one of the biggest game changers in my whole thought process, was that podcast. So I'm super thankful for it. So that's why I asked, like, how did you find it? But yeah, I'm probably the same way. Probably Googled how to buy rental properties, and they're pretty good at the top.
Right, right. And then you start listening to Brandon Turner. And then, I really like the podcast platform because you really get to connect with the hosts. And even though you never meet them,
Yeah.
you almost feel like you know them. And so you get to join part of their journey.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
So tell me about that. So tell me about your first flip. So were you still scientist while doing that first flip?
I was so full-time scientist. I had this rental on the side, which I was sort of, it was going well, but I was haphazardly learning how to become a landlord. And then, yeah, I got this great idea to do a flip. But this was 2021. So the market was just crazy hot. From everything that I read, it was like too hot to fail. And I sort of experienced that. So I did everything you possibly could do wrong on your first flip. It took me probably 6 times longer than it should have taken me. It costed me way more than it should have costed. But the market was so hot that even though it took 6 months longer than it should have, the house continued to appreciate over that time, and it buffered any of the mistakes that I had made. And then I made money on it, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, flipping is the easiest thing in the world. I could do this forever. And that was a terrible like experience on the back end, because I did start to believe that flipping was easy, right? Like the market was just too good to fail. And so that's what I leaned into. I was like, okay, well, this is cool. I made some money. It wasn't a ton of money. I think I made like 30 grand on my first flip, but the proof was in the pudding, right? I wanted to be able to make larger influx of capital quickly so that I could buy more rentals. And I was like, holy crap, this worked. And so I decided, hey, I want to do this more often. But flipping that first house was really tough. I mean, I learned a lot of lessons along the way, but I think the biggest lesson I learned was I don't particularly enjoy being on site or managing contractors. Like that's just not part of the business that I like. And so after my first flip and realizing that, I actually brought my brother on to be my project manager. So I figured if I could split the responsibilities, I would focus more on the acquisition side of things, the deal flow, the number crunching. And if he could focus on working with the contractors, that would really allow my business to expand quickly. But this is all while I was still doing the scientist role. That was a challenge. It didn't work out exactly how I had planned. We bought a couple more flips, and the market had corrected at that time frame. We still were learning a lot of lessons along the way, and so the next two flips we actually lost money on. So it was a really humbling lesson learning that flipping a house isn't really that easy. But I can take this a lot of different directions. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I want to know that first property. How did you find it? That first flip. How did you find that property? Because I know everybody has a different direction on how they find properties. Some find them from wholesalers. Some are sending out mailers. How did you find that one?
That's a really good question, and that's something that let me backtrack really quickly and talk about my first rental, because we mentioned the bigger pockets. So when I was trying to find a rental, I didn't really know where to look to find a good agent. Mind you, I didn't know much about real estate. I was still really green around the edges. So I went to the bigger pockets forum, and I was looking at all of these questions that were being asked in the Phoenix area, and there was one realtor who was answering all the questions. Her name was Melanie, and I was like, holy crap, this Melanie person seems to really know her stuff. So I reached out to Melanie sort of whimsically and was like, hey, I'm looking for a rental. Is there any chance you'd be able to work with me? And she was just absolutely fantastic. Like she was such a good realtor. She held my hand through the majority of the first couple of months. And she went to like 6 different properties with me. And then anyway, we ended up with our first rental. So I had learned that Bigger Pockets was a pretty good resource to find agents. And I did the exact same thing for my first flip. So I went back to the forums. I was looking at questions that people were asking in regards to how to flip a house in Phoenix, Arizona. And this other individual, Zach, was answering questions, and I did the exact same thing. Reached out to him, and same thing. He sort of held me held my hand through the first process of what the acquisitions look like for a flip. And he actually brought me the deal. So I told him exactly what I was looking for. I hadn't heard from him in 2 weeks. So I was like, oh man, I don't know if this guy is just kicking tires or if he's not interested in working with me. But in reality, what he was doing was he was looking for exactly what I had asked him to look for. And 2 weeks later, he was like, Cecil, I have the perfect property for you. Let's do this. And I ran it through my underwriting at the time. It was pretty novice underwriting, but it all made sense to me. And it worked out. That was the first flip. So that's how I found it.
And you made 30 G's?
Made 30 G's. Yeah. So it was a
30 G's.
pretty good first experience.
Okay. So then we go into now a few of the other ones that you've did, and you said you lost money on those ones. How did you acquire those properties? Was it the same person? Was it the same strategy? And why do you think that you lost money on those ones?
Sure. So that first flip I purchased in 2021, it wrapped up in 2022. And then we purchased these next two properties in early 2022. So I think February or March. One of those I found in working with a wholesaler. So I had learned in that time that you can work with wholesalers in the market who, will get properties from distressed sellers and then present them to you at a discounted rate. And then, so that was one of the properties that we picked up. And then the other one we actually found on market as well. I think at the time there was still opportunity, and I believe there still is opportunity on market to find distressed properties that have flipping potential. So that's how we picked up those two properties. But the problem was we were still really green around the edges. We didn't have systems in place. We didn't have a good construction team. And so we were subbing out these jobs, and it was taking a lot longer than they should have. And in the time that we were doing these renovations, the market had corrected. It was maybe June of 2022, and interest rates started to spike. Demand went down considerably. You know the rest is history. And we had a really hard time selling those properties. And as a result, I think at the end of 2022, I think as a company, my brother and I took a $60,000 loss. So I was disheartened to say the least, but we learned a lot of lessons along the way.
Yeah, that's one of my buddies, a good friend of mine in the rental space, said the market over the last years has made a lot of dumb people look smart. And I'm not saying that about you.
Right.
Just
Right.
in a mastermind we were at, he said, hey, real estate investing's made a lot of dumb people look smart, meaning it was just if you had the money and you parked it into real estate, whether you were flipping properties or whether you were buying and holds, it was super simple. I've the first to admit now, yes, it's much more challenging to go out there and find rental properties that bring you like a good ROI. So it's interesting how there's markets that you can seize. And if you're just there with the right infrastructure, the right capital, I mean, you can just clean house, and then the market
Absolutely.
changes. All of a sudden the market changes and it's not so easy anymore. But I remember I had a friend call me who's a flipper, and it was during the time where the market was changing, right? And I remember him calling me and he's like, what do I do? And because I'd been selling real estate for years, never flipping properties, but I've been doing it for years. So he's like, what do you do in these seasons? I'm like, hey, here's the deal. It's the same for us as realtors. The market's changing. And sometimes you just have to, like as a flipper who has money that they're putting into the properties, sometimes you just have to lay back for 30, 45, 60 days and just figure out what the rules are again. Like what are the new rules? And sometimes because we can almost get stuck, I feel, we can sometimes hinder ourselves by our goals because, hey, I want to flip this many properties this year. And so you're almost like the goal is to flip this many units instead of I want to make this much money. And so it's really hard for that person to sit there who made a business plan in January and all of a sudden it's March and you're saying like, hey, I think I need to hold off for like 45 or 60 days and see what the landscape looks like so I can participate again. And so if you're just focused on how many properties you're flipping that year, you really lose sight of like what the real goal is, and it's to make a profit, right? So it's just like interesting how like that happens where markets just in 17 years of selling real estate, I've probably had about 10 different times where you're just sitting back and you're just so for you guys in the flipping space, sometimes it's maybe like, hey, I'm not going to buy anything right now. I'm going to figure out like what the landscape is. We as realtors, that's not our gig, because we're not putting our capital into these properties on listing properties. Ours is how to explain that to our clients intelligently while that's happening, because
Right.
they're still calling you to sell their property and you've got to give them advice. I'm paid for my advice. So during that 45 or 60 days, why maybe a flipper is holding back and deciding what they're going to do, I, as a realtor, I'm trying to figure out like a new conversation. You get in these flows, almost like these talk tracks. You get in these talk tracks with your clients for 6 years, and then all of a sudden you're like, wait, my talk track, like like these same conversations that I've been having that are clockwork with my clients, all of a sudden now aren't like clockwork. Now I'm having to think about the conversation. They're harder conversations. There's some tears in the conversation. So it's like, it's just new rules, and you got to figure out how to participate in that game. Again, I always equate it to, I think of it like Bill Belichick, the coach of the New England Patriots. Like, there's some new rules that come out every year in football. I don't think we hear about them as much. Like, there's some little nuances of rules that come out. He's always been the one that, like, the next year I'll be watching like Sunday Night Football, and they'll be talking about like, oh, he's doing this because of that new rule. And I'm like, man, so like the game's the same, right? Like, it's still football. It's just there's a few new rules, and he's always the one studying it and figuring out how to use it to his advantage. So that's kind of how I look at it. So how do you go through 30,000 plus, profit, and then go through a 60 negative? I mean, like, that had to be, was there any doubt in continuing?
Absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
especially with my brother, because those were his two first flips. He didn't experience the $30,000 profit
Okay.
on the front end. So he was definitely questioning like what is. So I convinced my brother to leave his full-time position to join me on this pursuit,
Wow.
mind you, but I was still doing this full-time scientist gig. And it was at that moment when we had lost money that I realized, if I want to take this seriously and do exactly what you said, we needed to adapt, right? Because what we were doing was no longer applicable for this new market environment. And so we did exactly what you said. We took a step back, we looked at our business plan, and we tried to adjust accordingly. And the cool thing about not doing well on projects is there are so many lessons that you can learn from those projects. And I think that's the most important takeaway is we learned so many things that we could have improved on. And so after we had sold those two projects, we took a step back and we said, okay, one, is this something we want to continue doing? And then two, if so, how can we do this so that we can mitigate any of the mistakes that we made previously? And one of those big changes was that I needed to be full time in this business because doing this part time, it just wasn't making sense on the acquisition side of things, as well as my brother he still needed a lot of help on the project management as we were both still learning the business. So that was, I think, step one. So I left my career as a scientist and came full time into flipping just after we lost money, which was definitely a challenge. But I knew the proof of principle was there. The business model made sense to me. It wasn't particularly difficult. But I think the most important change that we made was we really dialed in our buy box. So before this experience of losing money on these two flips, we were kind of just buying anything where the numbers made sense. And in doing so, again, we learned so many lessons of what we did wrong. And we were also doing like HGTV style renovations, right? We were like taking walls down and retrenching sewer lines. Like we thought that's what flipping meant. And then once we dialed it back and we started leaning into some mentors, people who are also flipping in this space, and they kind of, held us through some of their projects and showed us some of the things that they were doing. I think all of that in culmination was really helpful in realigning our buy box and our business plan. And so we did exactly that, came into 2023 saying, okay, if we do, our goal was to flip 8 projects this year, netting on average $30,000 per project and buying with a very specific buy box and not buying outside of that buy box, because this is sort of our year to lay the foundation and build this business to a place where we can systematize it and grow it. And I'm really happy to say it's August now and we're on our 7th flip. So we're definitely in front of our business plan. And that alignment that we did, like you had said, was really helpful for us to just get on the right track. And getting my license, and that might be a segue, but getting my license was part of that new business plan, so that we could start saving money on the listings as well as learn the process of how to purchase and sell a house from behind the scenes, which I thought was really helpful for me.
So how did you even learn how to like underwrite one of these properties? I mean, I've sold many, many homes, and still, like, if I was looking at a property, like if I go into a client's property, I'm, when I look at the kitchen island, obviously there's a cost of getting quartz on there, right? And there's the cost of a 1,700 square foot putting flooring down and painting and, new fascia and, the whole deal. So like, how did you learn that? I get where when somebody's did it 6, 7, 8 times that they learn it, right? You just know now, like, especially as you go into a house now, you probably just almost can, like, your gut feeling probably already knows kind of where it's going to be. Now
Oh
you
yeah.
do some math behind that and you fact check it. But when it's not just a gut feeling, how did you initially learn that skill to buy a property?
Honestly, I think I was a little zealous, and I brought in a lot of different subs to give me a lot of different bids because I frankly I didn't know what it would cost to replace flooring or to throw quartz countertops on. And so for every single project that we were subbing out, we would bring in at least three different subcontractors to provide a bid. And we figured in doing so, we would learn sort of what the range would look like in terms of how to bid out a project. And I think it was a lot of trial and error. I think with my first flip, I got a better sense of what renovation costs look like. And then as you like you said, as you continue to do more and more, you get a better sense just intuitively what that range looks like. But I think for me and for anybody who wants to get into the flipping space, I think there's two things that you can do. One, spend a lot of time with somebody who can act as a mentor, who's flipped properties before, because that would really speed up the learning curve there. And then two, yeah, just get a ton of bids from a ton of different contractors early on, because getting that knowledge out of the way up front really helps on the acquisition side of things before you ever purchase the property.
Yeah, because I mean, I can understand the after you buy the property getting a lot of bids, but that whole underwriting that property, because I'm sure for you to buy a property, I'm sure you've looked at 40,
Oh yeah,
so it's like and nothing, you will drive a contractor crazy if you were trying to get them into all 40 of those properties to give you bids, right? That's the probably the fastest way to lose your relationships with your contractors is try to get them to go bid work that you don't have. And so when your very first one, like when you got that first one in front of you from the bigger pockets guy that you said you met, like how did you run, like how did you know on that one? And I get it, like the market was just super hot, and so maybe it was just something where you got in and it just worked out, but like how did you underwrite that very first property to say like I'm going to go get money from someone, place a bet on this and turn a profit? Like how did you run
sure.
the solid numbers?
So I was using at the time, there is a bigger pockets calculator on how to flip a house. And so, they give you a calculator and you can punch numbers in there. And I actually worked with my realtor on that one, Zach, and he had a really good idea of what the renovation costs were going to be because he had been doing this type of business for a while. And so him and I sat down, we walked through the calculator, and he gave me a general sense of what he thought the renovation cost would be. And then we added a contingency in place. I think at the time it was 20% plus or minus, assuming that our costs would be close to our estimated. And then once we ran those numbers through the calculator, and he had put together an ARV, an after repair value estimate for what he thought the property would be worth after we fixed it all up. Once I saw those numbers and put it into the calculator, then I felt a lot more confident. And I'm also a numbers guy, right? So with a science background, once I see the numbers, I can take a little bit of the emotion out of it and just run the numbers. And if there's a green at the end of those numbers, then I'm usually pretty happy if it's if it made sense. But for me, for the first flip, honestly, I wasn't looking for a huge profit.
Yeah.
But I was really looking for is just the knowledge. Like if I
Yeah.
can do this proof and principle, I can hopefully scale it. And so I was less interested about making a ton of money. I just wanted to see if I could flip a house for a profit.
And it's cool that you just lean into somebody who's already experienced. Obviously that realtor made a commission off that property. And, not all realtors are the same. So you call one realtor and they might not know how to talk about flipping, right? It's kind of the same as I would say, like with myself, like when clients, I have a lot of clients who call me that want to park money into rentals, and they couldn't call every realtor and have that conversation. Like they're calling me because they're like, hey, I have this much money. Where would I park it? What's my ROI? What's my ROI going to be? How much do you think I'm going to make? They want me to help them sometimes with how to set up doing their own property management because we do that for ourselves. And so I can like see the same thing that you did. You went out and found an experienced person, an experienced realtor in that space of flipping and got your basic knowledge right there. And he made a fee. It's the same thing I do with my clients. It's, hey, they call me and they're, hey, we want to buy a rental property. And I'm like, this is, and it's like such second nature to me. And so I'm like, hey, this is like a totally slam dunk deal. And they're sitting there and they're like, I don't know. And I'm like, no, this is a slam dunk deal. But that's interesting how like something being so solid and being convicted by it is because you just did it enough. And when you're new, everything looks scary, even if you have a trusted source telling you that it's probably a good purchase. Like there's still always this little bit of anxiety. So with how did you find the money on those deals? Are we doing hard money on these or?
I am, yeah. So as a scientist, I was making a decent amount of money at the time. But I took a home equity line of credit out of my house. I think I mentioned earlier on, I was very interested in the Dave Ramsey debt snowball approach. And so I was really paying into my mortgage at the time. And so I had this, 2021, 2022, the equity or the appreciation of the property rose pretty quickly, and so did my equity. And so I took a line of credit out against that. and used that to flip my first house, which was incredibly helpful. I didn't know a thing about bookkeeping at the time or accounting, so I kind of just honestly fumbled my way through the first flip. Looking back, I would like to say that it was really well calculated and I did everything well, but honestly, I probably did everything you possibly could wrong, and it still worked out. Um, but you said something, Chris, that I want to lean into, which is like when I had just gotten into this world of real estate investing, I didn't appreciate the knowledge of a sophisticated realtor. And when I say sophisticated, I mean somebody who's got experience and specifically, an investor friendly agent or somebody who's niched down into the space. But when you meet that individual, because I did talk with a couple other realtors, and you can sort of differentiate their knowledge base just on how they answer questions. But when you find one that has the answers to almost every question you're asking, and you can see this person's done it before, it's a game changer. And I think it provided me a lot of confidence that this first flip would work out because I did feel like somebody was sort of holding my hand through it, which was great. Honestly, it was a really great experience. But it's not often that you find somebody who has that much knowledge. I think you have to pick through a lot of weeds before you can find somebody who really can walk you through that investment strategy if they've done it before.
Yeah, because I mean, like I said, all realtors aren't, equal as far as knowledge. And that's fair to say. Bold statement, but totally fair to say. And how I, because I've bought properties out of state, and one of my leading questions will sometimes be, what do you not specialize in?
That's
Like,
good.
because I will give people 19 things in real estate that I actually like legally am allowed to do as a licensed realtor in Arizona that I don't do. I refer like me being able to make money off that with my license and telling people I don't do that should establish ground. Like, I don't just do this for money. I do like I want to enter into something that I feel super confident about, that I feel that I can control the situation, I can deliver like the best value to them. And so I'm like, hey, if I went over here and started doing, commercial, like, not saying I couldn't do that if I wanted to lean into that lane, but like when somebody calls me for commercial, I'm just like, hey, like here's a referral to somebody. And like, hey, well, kind of want you to help me. And I'm like, no, like you actually you legitimately don't. And they're like, why not? I'm like, because I wouldn't do that for myself. So like if I would call somebody right now to help me find that, then why would I allow you to give me money for that? So like I would just want you to go to that person that I would use. And so I like how you brought that up, because as you got your real estate license, was that kind of just to say like, hey, we could save these, few percentage points in this whole process?
Honestly, it was. I think, and this is my experience. It's probably not true for everybody, but consider myself, I consider myself a fast learner once I get a grip of what the business model looks like. But for those first 6 months, I'm a terribly slow learner. Like, give me 6 months and then I take off running. But for the first 6 months, I feel like I have to get my hands dirty. And that's kind of where I was in the business. We just flipped there's two homes where we were losing money. And it dawned on me that we could sort of bootstrap our way to success, right? So like we were tightening all of our numbers, and one of those things that we could tighten was the listing commission. We were working with Zach, still the same realtor who had helped us, and we had come to an agreement on listings, and he was going to list our projects for us for a very specific price, and it worked out really well. But it did dawn on us that we could save money on the backside of things if I were to get my license, and so that was the motivation. I'm glad I did it. So I've learned a lot over the process of this last year. We've done several transactions, and I get to feel like what's going on behind the scenes. I've learned it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work. It's not necessarily in alignment with my goal of being a real estate investor, which has been interesting. So I've really enjoyed saving the money. Obviously, that was like the main component of me getting my license. But I've also learned I'm not a huge fan of the paperwork. I'm not a huge fan of the negotiations. I'm not very good at really taking the transaction from listing to escrow. So it's been a lot of lessons learned. And this is something that I've sort of leaned into quite a bit, because when you first get into real estate investing and specifically flipping homes, there's like that question that sort of presents is, hey, are you going to get your license to facilitate the transaction? That sort of naturally pops up. And when I first got my license, I thought the answer was like, obviously, yes, this makes the most sense. It's the most, efficient business model there is. And now that I'm further into this space, I'm leaning more into what I like to do, how I like to spend my time, and more importantly, where is my time most efficient, right? So where am I making the most amount per hour of my time worked? And I'm learning it's not being a realtor, right? So it's being a realtor is a pain. It's a lot of work, and it is It's a challenging job. And so I don't know if you want to get into it on this, but you and I recently connected on what it might look like working together on some of the listings for these transactions, because it's been a lot of work trying to balance both being a real estate investor and also a realtor. And I'm really keen on the idea of outsourcing that component of the business. So I went from not having a license to getting a license to now wanting to work with you on listings, which is really interesting.
Yeah, it's just from a business owner, it's not scalable.
It's not
Meaning like
scalable.
you already told me like, hey, I don't want to be on the project, right? And so, it's like, hey, I don't want to be on the project, but then I want to list the project. It just doesn't seem like an alignment, and it's just not scalable. It's the same as like a realtor like myself who like doesn't necessarily like show homes to clients anymore. I pay somebody to do that for me, right? And so because I look at it and I say it's not scalable, and a lot of realtors be like, I that doesn't make any sense. And I'm like, well, yeah, it does. Like if you go out and get 15 buyers who want to look at homes and they all want to look on Saturday, is that scalable? It's not. So like they're not being able to grow it. They're not being able to grow a big business because their structure doesn't allow them to, because it's like, how would you go flip four a month if you're
Right.
the if you're the realtor on it and you're the project manager on it and you're whatever. So it's just like we all have and I think it's you got to gradually get there. I
Absolutely.
actually think I'm coming to terms with this now, being in business for 17 years, is there's almost always something. I feel, maybe this is just my experience, but I feel like there's always something that you're doing that you shouldn't be doing, but it just like levels up, meaning it's like, hey, I might have this employee now and that employee, and I'm focusing in this lane because this is the best use of my energy in my company to get it to keep moving. But there's always like there's always still something else that I'm like, I'm doing this, but I feel like it needs to be passed off to somebody else. So like I've wrestled with that over the last 17 years of I'm building, hire someone. Then it's like for like 3 months, you're staying in your lane of flow state is what I consider, like when you're humming because it's like you've got good energy every day because you're doing exactly what you want to do. And then all of a sudden, I feel like as you start staying in that lane of flow state where you're humming and everything's going good, all of a sudden you build a little bit bigger. And as you build that a little bit bigger, you get attached to something, right? And you get
Mhm.
attached to something now that you're like, okay, now that the scale got a little bit bigger, I've got to do this as the owner of the company because that person's got that role, that person's got that role. And me, I'm ultimately responsible for the whole ship because I own it. So like I've got it, like whatever we scale to, I've got to take on that piece because these people are totally full and I don't quite have the profits to hire for that person yet. So I got to keep it. So I feel like we're just in this scale, stay in flow state of what we like to do for about 3, 4, 5 months. We build it a little bit bigger. We get a job that we don't necessarily want anymore. And then after about 4 or 5 months, we get rid of that one. And that's ultimately, I think, how a company scales. So it's cool to see that you have went through that journey because I'm talking to more and more investors who not only flip properties, but list their own properties. And I find that I got to send them that book, Buy Back Your Time, because I'm
Yes.
like,
Yeah.
are you sure? Because I'm like, there's already a co-broke involved, so we got to already write that one off. Like, you're not saving any money on the co-broke. And then I'm like, there's this side that the realtor makes, and when I look at it, I'm like, hey, just the whole 45-day paperwork process. A realtor, like someone else might say, like, hey, that's not hard. But like for somebody like you who's highly paid to be in a certain lane, I remember Brett, our mutual buddy, we sat down at lunch. I mean, this was probably a year ago, and he's just like, dude, why don't you flip properties? And I'm like, because that's not my flow state. That's your flow
Mhm.
state. Like, you know how to do that. So, like, when you walk into a property, all you're thinking in your brain is systematically, how would I flip this property? When I walk into that property and see it, I'm looking at it like I have no system. So it's interesting how flipping a property for you and me, it's the same process, right? The process is the same, whether you flip that house or I flip that house. You just have systems in place to make
Right.
that process simpler. So it's like, that's like all a business is like the problem or the process is always the same. It's just who has systems for that, or when they look at it, like when I look at listing a house, I'm like that's like clockwork, right? Like that listing's going to come in, Brittany's going to go do her thing, then it's going to go on the market, then calls are going to come in, I'm going to stay in flow state and do my job. I like to negotiate, it's going to go under contract, it's going to go to Christy's going to do her checklist. So it's like everyone's in their flow state. So cool that you saw that now, man. And do
Yeah,
you
and
feel that, but you do feel that getting in the weeds a little bit helped you probably understand maybe the complexities of like what a real estate transaction looks like?
it did. Honestly, I think getting my license was a great decision. I like how you worded it in that there is a natural growth ceiling for every state, and you have to level up past that state. I feel very fortunate. Before I started investing like heavily in the fix and flip business, I started reading more entrepreneurial books, and one in particular comes in mind. It's well, there's a couple. There's Traction by Gino Wickman, which was
Yeah.
really helpful in teaching me how to come up with a business plan. Um, and then the other one is by Michael Gerber, and that's gosh, it's right behind me here. I wonder if I have it. Well, I don't, but
Is it
it's
the E Myth?
the E Myth
Yeah.
Revisited.
Yeah.
It's a fantastic book that teaches you, and it sounds like obviously you've read it, but it teaches you how to not work in the business but on the business. And I think I came into this space really appreciating the complexity, but also the efficiency involved in working on the business and not necessarily in the business. When I got my license, I realized that wasn't necessarily going to be the case, but I did feel like one, it was going to help us bootstrap the financials, but also to teach me the ins and outs of what it means to be in escrow and what it looks like to move one property from our name to somebody else's. So I did find that helpful. But like you said, it wasn't part of my flow state. And I think I didn't quite appreciate what my flow state was until we flipped. I think it was our third property this year. My role now, as I've elevated in this business, is I really just like to focus my time and attention on acquisitions, underwriting, and for the time being, transaction coordination because I was, facilitating that realtor role. But there was one property that we flipped, and I remember I calculated how much time I spent on this property from underwriting from acquisitions to underwriting, and then my brother took over for project management, and then me back on the back end with the realtor business. I think it was like 16 of my hours, so a full 16 hours from beginning to end. And I think we turned a $45,000 profit on that one project. And I just realized, and I'm splitting those profits with my brother, but I worked 16 hours to make a $45,000 profit on a project because I was in my flow state. And had I been able to outsource the realtor side of that component, it probably would have been closer to like 6 to 7 hours. And when I realized that, I was like, holy crap, I can make a lot of money focusing in on like what is really my flow state. And I like the way you worded that. And once that made sense to me, I've been looking at my business in a way that I'm trying to outsource everything I possibly can that allows me to stay in my flow state. And it's not always as easy as it sounds. And I do find myself doing things that I probably shouldn't be doing. But my ultimate goal is, like you mentioned, to slowly outsource things over time that allows me to focus in that flow state for as most amount for the majority of my time as I can.
Yeah, it's
Because
a
that's
yeah, I mean it's a fascinating concept, and I learned this from listening to a podcast of a guy who talks about it all the time. And he'll say just even if you can't hire for it, like just in your day, acknowledge when you're out of flow state, whether it's like something that you ate, an action that you did, a person that you're talking to, a task that you have to do in your business. And he's like, just acknowledge it. And I think that's the coolest part is once you acknowledge something, then there can be like once you acknowledge something on a daily basis, you can then go into like some solutions. Your brain starts thinking differently, in my opinion. So it's like I have a list on my phone, like I have a note, and it's just things that get me out of flow state. And I and
oh, that's brilliant.
I love to know like, hey, this gets me out of flow state. Here's the deal: certain of these tasks I have to do. Like certain of them are, I had to go do some stuff with my doctor recently, and I wrote down like that got me out of flow state. Like just doing that process. So when my brain looks at it now and says, okay, if that gets me out of flow state and I have to do this, like I might have to do this my whole life. But like now, when would you do this? Like,
Mm-hmm.
is there a week of the year where you do all that stuff that gets you out of flow state, but you can't hire to an assistant because it's your life? So like put that maybe at one time of the year where you're like, hey, for these 5 days, I'm gonna go get this blood work, get this checked up, get this. So it's just 5 days. So, but it's not like, it's not right before you're going into a listing appointment where you got to be on your A game. So I just like to always look at it and say, like, I want to acknowledge when I'm out of flow state and then see like, is there anything I can do about it? And there's probably about 90% of the things you put on that list that you're like, I actually don't have to do this. And then the next
Yes.
thing is going to be like, okay, well, this cost a little bit of money to fix. And then you just decide right there, like, do you want to place your bets on like, hey, if I fix this and it costs money, but then people start looking at it like, well, if I exchange money to go fix this problem, and I'm like, No, like the goal in life is to stay in flow state as long as possible. So if you got to pay $70 to keep that person doing that job to keep you in flow state, like you'll keep doing the things that you feel really good about. And I'm finding out that, man, if you just feel good in your day, for some reason, the money just comes to you because like you're just staying in a positive energy. The world around you feels that from you. Like, man, he's always happy. He's doing what he does. And I think that's just flow state.
I love that. I love that. I love that you write down what's taking you out of flow state because I think that's so crucial because, there are times in my life, and I'm speaking sort of the last 6 months, there are times where I can spend maybe 20 hours a week in my flow state and I just crush the week, right? I'm dominating. We've got deals flowing. We're making money. Everything is making sense. And then I'll have weeks where I spend like maybe 2 hours in flow state where I'm doing 2 hours of the tasks that one I enjoy doing, which I think is helpful, right? Those light tasks as opposed to like what some people consider heavy tasks. And those weeks are the worst weeks of the year, like we're not doing well in the company and I'm spending my time doing things that don't drive money. And I think that's another thing that I've learned over the last 6 months is like not all tasks are created equal. And when you are in this flow state that you enjoy that makes the most or the highest return on investment, which is your time, right? So you're making the most amount of money per time. And then you realize you're spending most of your time not doing those tasks, then there's misalignment with your business
Yep.
plan and your ultimate goal. So yeah, I think actually it's that conversation that I had with Brett, which is how and why he connected us. He was like, you have to talk to Chris Bowers because like one, he's deeply invested in this mindset and obviously you've systematized your business in a way that I find really inspirational. So like I'm so pumped we're catching up more and we're talking more because like I want to lean into this so much more than I am already.
Yeah.
And I can't wait to pick your brain more on this.
And I like how you said like all tasks aren't created equal because this is something that I'm noticing too over the last probably 6 months. But my wife sometimes will be like, hey, like I'll be like, this is common in my house, but like that gets me out of flow state. And this is usually all about work stuff because we work together. I'm like, that gets me out of flow state. Someone else has got to do it. And she sometimes will be like, takes like 10 minutes. And I'm like, it's not the time, it's flow state, meaning I'll go into my office and do 3 hours of something that keeps me in flow state and happy for 3 hours, where somebody else would come in and what makes me feel peaceful would not put them in flow state. So I'm like, it's never time on flow state. Like that 12-minute task is not my 12-minute flow state, but like that 3 hour task that somebody else, it's not their flow state, is mine. So it just shows you like we're all different personalities. We have different opinions. We have different goals. So just because we have a job to do, like there's still the starting line and the finish line. So for like all realtors or all flippers, there's a starting line, got to find a property, got to analyze it. There's a finish line, sold, done, gave keys to someone, you made your money. So like there's a starting line and there's a finish line. And like there's so many things in that process that you, like for example, if we just took like you and Brett, same starting line, same finish line, same process in between, but there's going to be certain things for you as the like ex scientist that's going to keep you in flow state. And there's going to be something on his end that's going to keep him in flow state. And that's like just realizing that just because we're in the same industry or doing the same project doesn't mean there's tasks that, confuse or annoy, or you just feel like, hey, I'm actually not the best at this and I shouldn't be doing it. Like someone else who makes money doing this every day should be doing that. So, but
No, absolutely. And I've got to lean into something you said because I really liked it. I love that you and Brittany talk about this openly. And I think that's so important when you have a committed partner because my significant other is also coincidentally named Brittany. And her and I, with COVID, we've sort of worked in the same small space for almost 3 years now because she was working remotely. And when I was a scientist, I was working remotely. And now we both do real estate full time. And this idea of being in a state of full efficiency and then being pulled out of that state, even for something small, like, oh, hey, would you mind go scrubbing the pool? It's not only the 10 minutes it takes to scrub the pool, but it's the 45 minutes ish, right? That takes you to get back into flow state, right? So you've now interrupted almost an hour of your full efficiency. So I think having that open communication with your partner or whoever sort of exists in your space is so keen. And Chris, before you and I jumped on, you mentioned that you only respond to messages certain times of the day. And I read that same thing in the 4 Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss. And I've talked about this openly with a lot of people. I'm not there yet in my business, but I love the model. And I just love that you're currently incorporating that. Have you seen that it increases your efficiency?
yes, it's increased my efficiency and your peace of mind. And I'm finding out anymore that like we have to protect our peace of mind. I think people think, and I used to think this, my younger self, I thought I was trading my peace of mind for a profit. I thought that was the ultimate goal, was
Mm.
you gave your, like, you were renting yourself out to people. Like, they were buying your time for a certain amount of period, and you made a significant income doing so. And so I always thought like I was being rented. Like, hey, like they're gonna get 45 days of my time. I'm gonna make $14,000. And then I realized that I don't think that's always how it had to be. It was just my younger version of myself. And now my older version of myself is saying that I feel that I can do a very, very, very good job for people. And I don't have to feel attached to something all day long. Cause it's an unrealistic expectation of, hey, like every time someone calls you that you would respond. For example, we're on this podcast right now, and I actually had to do one text, right? Because I had a 9 o'clock and we started a little late. So I text that person and said, hey, I'm going to be a little bit late. But like, that's like, my phone's on do not disturb. But like, I don't see any of the other like 45 texts that have come through in the last hour, because I have to look at that and say, like, how, like, I almost felt disrespectful to you just looking down at my phone for like 2 seconds to say, like, hey, I'm going to be a little bit late. I was like, that's inappropriate to be on a podcast and sending that text. And it was. So, like, I just lived my whole life like that. I'm saying, like, if you're living very, very intentional and always doing stuff that's like on point, then it's disrespectful. So, for example, and then please note, I'm not getting on a high horse. Just these are my mind thoughts. Is like when I'm at the gym, I used to like text people back. And I'm like, it was getting me out of flow stakes. I'm like, I'm not only there at the gym to try to, like, stay healthy. I'm there just kind of like as therapy for peace of mind, like that's like a time, that's an hour to like get yourself together. It's focusing on you. It's like mental clarity. So like every time I got done with doing something, I would like go to my phone and text people. And I'm like, it's not even fair. And I realized it the first time when I was at a red light, and we got to the red light and I texted a few people back. And when I got back to my office, I'm like, that wasn't fair to send them that text like that, because it was so short, because I
Mm.
was trying to get through 9 texts at the red light. So I gave no real thought to this. So I realized, like, it's for them and me. It's for me to have peace of mind. And it's also for them, so that when I get to my hour where I'm going to follow up with everybody and put a lot of thought into this, that they're getting a proper answer that's very well thought out. There's good context to it. Sometimes I'm like, hey, I'm just going to pick up the phone and call them because I don't think this is going to go the right way. So yeah, man, it's a newer version of myself. And don't get me wrong, I still fell at it daily, but like I'm super commit. I fell at it daily, but I wake up every day super committed to trying my hardest to do it. That's all I
Yeah,
can say, is like
absolutely.
it's very intentional, and I flop a lot of days, and there's certain days where you're like, it goes AWOL. But I love knowing, I love sun comes up, sun goes down. Like, meaning, like, just because I messed up that day doesn't mean the whole year's got to be that process. So I'm like, hey, like that day didn't go the way I want it to, but the next day I'll be committed to trying again.
Yeah, yeah, fail forward. I love that model. And I think, gosh, I hadn't thought about the intentionality of bringing your best self when you can time block those types of responses, because you're so right. We're all guilty of shooting that quick text and then realizing, oh, I didn't give it my time. There's probably like 6 typos. I wasn't actually thinking through it. I mean, that's a really great point. I'm going to think about that over the next couple of days, because I'm intentionally trying to lean into this as well and being more present. This is definitely a struggle point in my life as well, especially balancing all these different projects. I'm constantly on the phone. And Brittany and I talk about this a lot, and trying to be more present, one for each other, but also for our friends and family. And definitely something that I'm trying to lean into more. So that was really great perspective. I appreciate it.
So let's go into, and sorry, I leaned in like a lot of things that I've talked about. So I want to make this back to you on just, so now let's go into, so you lost the 60 G's. Now you went into, you've obviously been doing well on your other one. So what got you into a different path? So you made some different systems, which you said your buy box got a little bit tighter. I'm sure that's a very intentional. Talk a little bit more about your next flips.
Sure. Yeah. So systems was it, man. We dialed in our buy box. I realized in order to purchase a property in our buy box, we were going to have to look at a lot more deals, because we're no longer just buying everything under the sun. So once we nailed in our buy box, we really dialed into our CRM. We're using Monday.com sort of to screen all of our deal flow and funnels. And now our goal, and my goal specifically on the acquisition side of things, is I'm looking at 50 to 100 deals a day, right? And this is mostly wholesale deals
A
that get
day?
sent to me, or yeah, but here's the thing that I think is really misleading, is when you get to this point where you know exactly what you're looking for, when you're looking at 100, let's just say 50 deals a day, because it's not always that much deal flow. I'm really only giving these deals or these properties 3 seconds of my time,
Yep.
right? Because I know exactly, I know what zip codes I'm looking for, the purchase price, how big it is. I have all of these criteria that I'm looking at. And of those 50 deals that come in, let's say three of them hit all of my buy box. Well, 47 of them I was able to screen within 3 seconds. And so they very quickly come in and out of our pipeline, which is really helpful, right? So like I'm no longer chasing deals that don't make sense for our business model. So that helped incredibly in narrowing down exactly what properties we're willing to purchase. And honestly, those numbers are a little fictitious in that we really are only seeing one or two deals per week that even would pencil out. And so once I see, let's say 50 deals come in and one of those deals are hitting all of the check marks in my buy box, we'll then take that to the next step, which is no longer screening, but actual underwriting. And then we will underwrite that deal with, best projections of how much it's going to cost to renovate, how much we can sell the property for, and then what those numbers look like. Depending on whether or not they hit a certain profit criteria, we'll decide whether or not we move forward and if we're going to go walk the property and then take it to the next level in that screening process. So systematizing this process and turning it more into a deal funnel and flow helped us a lot, because when I realized we needed to tighten up our buy box, we needed to get our eyes on a lot more projects just for us to purchase the properties we wanted to.
So how do you get that many properties in front of you in a day? I can understand that, like, you see something. I can understand that. 'Cause like when I was buying rental properties, I might be looking at 20 on the MLS, but it was like, I mean, click, 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 no, click,
Right.
click. Like, so analyzing a property, you got really good at it, right? So, like, how are you getting that many in front of you?
Honestly, I've done a lot of things, and I can unpack this over the course of a while, but let me try to make it succinct. The first thing that I did was my best deal source is wholesalers. And so I reached out to every possible wholesaler I could. And then I reached out to all fix and flippers who I knew in the valley, and I'm saying, what wholesalers are you working with that I'm not working with? And can you help me get on their list? So that was the first step, is just getting on every single wholesale list here in the valley. And I'm sure I'm still missing some,
And
but
why would somebody want to give you their source of flow? Like when you
yeah,
call
no,
another flipper, why would they have any interest in giving you their wholesaler?
right. No, I think that's a really good question. For me, I try to provide value in any possible way that I can. And I try to spend my time and energy helping people where I can. And I think I've developed really great relationships in this business. And in my experience, investors who are in this for the long haul understand the importance of strong relationships. And I've not had any issues, especially with those flippers who are close to me. Like they've all taken me under their wing. And Brett's a really great example. Brett put me on Spencer Caldwell's list, which was a list I wasn't even aware of. And that alone is about 30 deals a day that get presented to me. So I think if you pour into these people as much as they pour into you, they're willing to share.
Yeah. I think
Um,
that's so true, like in the real estate space too. Like I've had
yeah,
people ask me like, "Hey, why do all you realtors talk to each other and help each other out?" And I always will say the most simplistic thing. I'll say, because the world is actually so good. Like, and
yeah,
no matter what you see, like that's highlighted of all the negative, I genuinely just wake up every day saying like the world is good. And there's a lot of people looking to help each other out because like it makes them feel good. And yeah, we don't all have to work off money. Like there's just something good about being a good human being and saying like, hey, this person's trying, let's help them out, right? So cool to see.
absolutely.
Because I
Yeah,
know that's
yeah.
what the listeners are going to think. A second you're like, hey, why would somebody be interested? And I'm like, it's the same as if a realtor called me right now in North Peoria where I live and said like, hey, could you help me on how to build a business? I'd be like, cool. Like that sounds fair, right?
Yeah, we're all in this together. And I think for those of us who really want to pour into this business, I think we recognize that. Brett's a great example. Like him and I are often competing for the same deals. And he'll get it or I'll get it, and we'll joke around about it afterward, because at the end of the day, the deal flow is always going to be there if you put energy into it. And
Yeah.
it's okay if you have to share that deal flow. The market is big enough. The other thing, I'll just share this quickly. The other thing that I've done that helps with the deal flow is having my license, or even just working closely with a realtor, having that direct access to the MLS and setting up search criteria, of putting in your very specific buy box and having the MLS automatically send you those email notifications daily is also another thing that helps a lot. So for me, for example, I have an MLS auto notification set up for any deals that come on the market that have the fixer box checked, right? So if it's a fixer, it's going to come to me immediately. So that's another source of deal flow that I'm working directly on market, to look for potential opportunities. But those are, I think, two probably the biggest examples of where I've been able to maximize the amount of deals that come into our pipeline.
Yeah, I could see that being more beneficial is having access to the MLS on the buy side as the realtor, not necessarily the list side. I think, a lot of times people will say like the list, yeah. I just think it's like you having direct access is probably would be the most annoying thing if you weren't a realtor and you were relying on a realtor to give you that stuff. You know what I mean? Like you're waking up every day.
Absolutely.
You're waking up every day and you're your only client looking for these deals. Where if you have a realtor and they have 8 clients, you might be, at 3 p.m. they're sending you a deal, and that might be too late for what you're trying to accomplish. So probably really smart on your end to have your license for that part of the assembly line so that you like your whole day goes better.
I couldn't agree more. It's like perfectly in alignment with my goal to be better at acquisitions and completely out of my alignment on the listing side of things, which is what I'm learning now. But no, I couldn't agree with that more.
Do you feel that out of the whole entire thing is the hardest thing now just like how to scale this is the hardest part of the assembly line, the acquisition, like actually acquiring the property?
Absolutely.
Okay.
I would say there's three main pillars. Acquisitions is probably the most important just because you have to have that constant deal flow. Second is the renovation. So you have to have a team that you can rely on. And we didn't get into that, but that's been a journey in itself, right? Working with all these different contractors, finding who works well with your crew, so on and so forth. That's a different podcast in its entirety. But the renovation crew is the second component. And I think the third is capital. So those are probably the three main pillars when it comes to the fix and flip model is acquisitions, which is the deal flow, having a strong renovation team, and then having enough capital to do more than one project at a time. Because if you can only do one project at a time, you don't have a successful business model because you have to wait for that project to sell before you can start on another one. And the assembly line just doesn't work. So either you earn that capital or you raise that capital. But either way, you do, in order to scale this business, you have to have enough capital to do at least multiple projects at once. And when I say at once, in weeks spread between purchase and sale, but typically you'll have to have a couple in the pipeline so that this is completely automated.
Yeah. So what are you most excited about over the next 6 months with just the whole flipping space?
Yeah. Honestly, so I didn't dive into this in too much detail, but I flip properties to purchase rentals. That's kind of my big reason why. So I'm excited to one continue flipping, scaling this business up. Our goal this year was to flip 8 properties, and unless something goes completely AWire, we should hit that goal. And then next year we're hoping to flip 20 here in Phoenix, with the ultimate goal of learning from that business model and then moving out into different markets and exploring the Burr method, right? Buying, refinancing, rehab, or rehabbing, refinancing, and repeating it. So we're essentially taking this model and trying to push it into a different market. We're going to continue to flip in Phoenix at volume to provide capital to build out a rental portfolio. So in the next 6 months, I'm super bullish in the real estate market. I do think we're going to get a stabilization of rates. That's just my own personal opinion, probably, mid to high fives. And I think when that happens, market activity is going to continue to go up. And I feel like this year was the year where we built out our training wheels in the flipping business. I feel like finally, after flipping a dozen homes, we know what we're doing. And so the second the market corrects and we're in a position where the market activity drives back up, I feel like this flipping business is going to take off. And once that happens, I'm hoping that in parallel, I can start growing out a pretty strong rental portfolio. So that's kind of what I'm hoping the next 6 months look like for me.
Yeah, that's awesome that you brought that up because you meet a lot of flippers that say they're investors. That always has really intrigued me when they're like, I'm a lot of it. Like I've seen it even on like a lot of people's Instagram, profiles. Like I'm an investor, and then when I'm talking to them, they're like, oh, I flip properties, and I'm like, I don't know. I think that would be considered a job, right? Like that the
Absolutely.
same. And I'm no disrespect, but it's like if I was a realtor selling 100 homes a year, and somebody said, "What are you?" and I'm like, I'm an investor. I'm like, no, that's how I'm making my active income. Like I'm actually working to bring that in. So buying rental properties on the side, that's an investor. The whole buying your work and flipping it is just buying your work and flipping it. So I've always been like, I never really understood why like most flippers say that they're investors.
No, you're spot on. It's active income, and it is like I went from the scientist career to full time flipping, and I traded one active job for another.
Yeah.
And it's exactly that. So, like you, I really am fascinated with the idea of building out a rental portfolio. I'm still pretty small. I've got one rental in Casa Grande. I just bought a triplex here in North Phoenix, which I'm just like really happy about. I'm currently
Nice.
getting it rent ready, and then I did partner up. I got really interested in the multifamily space about a year ago and partnered up with some really great investors. And so I am a general partner of a 16 unit out in Albuquerque. But my goal is to continue building that side of the business. So ultimately I can buy back some of my time, right? Because this active role as the flipper eats a lot of my time.
I just love seeing like the energy on you wanting to improve. You see that, and I mean, you don't see that in everybody, and it's just like it's cool to see. Because I remember listening to Bigger Pockets podcast, and I remember Brandon, the host at the time, would always say, "Hey, if you can't yet do it, just do something in the assembly line that you can do that's free." And so I remember he would just say like, "Hey, analyze properties." Like even if you can't buy one right now, just analyze properties and just keep analyzing properties. And at least when something comes in front of you, you'd be able to say like, oh, I would buy that if I had the capital. Like you're learning one art that's very hard to learn. So like, it's very cool just to say like, hey, I would buy that with my little bit of knowledge of analyzing if I had the money. And then it's the person that can now say, okay, now like I learned how to analyze properties and that's one I would buy if I had money. So what's my next problem to get to my dream? And now I got to find money, right? And then
Right.
you could go
Right.
now just keep researching for the next 2 months on how one finds money. And then you probably get into the wholesale land of like, or you'll find somebody who will lend you money at a higher interest rate. And then, then it's like, hey, then, all right, now I'm analyzing properties and that's a good one. So now am I going to say now, like, am I going to place a bet on my skills and say, I want to go borrow this person's money to buy this? And then the craziest one is now you have a property and now you got to kind of learn that skill. Like, just you got to learn that skill while you have your hard money cost every day adding up.
Yeah.
And you know what I
Yeah.
mean? That's where it's like, so like, that's why I remember Brandon always talking about how your first property, it might take you 2.5, 3 months, where like maybe it would take someone else 2 weeks, but it might take you 3 months. Like you might make no profits on that property just because the hard money holding cost ate up all your money. But like if you break, like even if you broke away even, you like learn the process. Like you learn the process that you can now look at something and say, I button that up and I'm going to do better next time. Or I look at it and say, what if you lost $10,000 in that project, but got the knowledge? Like how many people will go to school and get a loan for $190,000 to get knowledge and then go implement it for a $60,000 a year job?
Right.
And I'm like, so
Totally.
why wouldn't you go like pay to get on the job knowledge, betting on yourself? Even if you lost 10 G's, you learned something. Maybe the next time you break even, then the next time you make $10,000, and the next time you make $40,000. Like it's this thing where like you see it in some people and it's in you. Like it's from the first time I talked to you on that Zoom, I was like, that's just in someone's DNA when they're like, hey, I'm gonna place a bet on myself, I'm gonna learn something, I'm gonna go do it. And it's super
Yeah.
cool to see, man. Like that's why I'm so excited to talk to more and more people. I'm glad to have you in my friend group now because like those people I love. I think Brett and you and I we're going to lunch, I think on Thursday.
Yep.
And like I
Yep.
was just
That's
like,
right.
man, getting those like just getting us all in a room where we're eating and talking, like it's just good. That to me anymore, I'm like, that's flow state. Like, even if that's not what I do, it doesn't matter if I'm talking to a scientist or I'm talking to a roofer. And I'm like, when they're talking about being in their flow state, I'm like, there's nothing more cool. There's nothing cooler than being around people that you like that are talking about their flow state and how excited they are to keep improving it.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree more. And thanks, Chris. I appreciate that, man. That means a lot to me. I think you said something that I'm sure resonates with you, but it's always been this way for me, or at least when I was in college, I always bet on myself. If all else, failed, I have a lot of confidence, and I think it takes a lot of courage, especially if you step into a new space. I've always been courageous if I put myself on the line, and I think that's helped a lot. So I really appreciate you saying that.
Yeah, man. Well, cool. I think we went probably about an hour now. We'll have another show here someday where we go deeper. I know this wasn't all specifics on flipping. I think there was a lot of mindset and flipping in there, but like I wanted to like I kind of freestyled this and kind of changed course when we got into it. Because I think that, like I said, the coolest part about like I think you're where you're succeeding the most is that it's just like it's you betting on yourself. I almost can imagine you could go open up a plumbing business in a week and like you would just be really good at it. I think a lot of people, including myself, have a lot to learn from that because those are just people that like they just commit to something and there's almost a no lose process in their mind. So um super thankful that we met a few months ago. I'm glad that we're doing some business together. And Any last thoughts to leave with the listeners?
No, I appreciate you saying that. I feel the same way. I heard Alex Ramosi say something not too long ago, and it really resonated with me. It was, you can make money doing anything, right? And that's so true. Like, I just chose real estate because the vehicle makes sense to me, but it really could be anything. So I guess if there's anything that I would leave with the listeners, it's, work on the mindset, build up the confidence, and then be courageous and, step into entrepreneurialism if it's a path for you, if you truly think it's a path for you. And, don't be afraid to jump ship and do something that your path, hasn't been in alignment with, right? I went from a scientist to now full-time real estate investor. There was some parallels that I could bring from that world to this, but not many. And it's the best decision I ever made. So I think that's probably what I'd leave people with.
Super cool story, man. Thanks for being on the podcast, man. And yeah, I really appreciate you. I'll see you on Thursday for some lunch.
Yeah, Chris, I
All
appreciate you having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
right, later, buddy.
All right, later, man.